afternoon, everybody from London, but I know we have people joining us from all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar on getting the most out of government data. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world, and our knowledge partners today at SAS with Intel. So in terms of today's topic, it's true to say that governments are collecting ever greater amounts of data as many public services go online and citizens increasingly choose to interact with government through websites and apps. So this adds to the information that government holds on its citizens across a host of central and local public services. So everything from health, education, demography, and employment. And we saw during the pandemic how useful this data and this information could be. For example, in helping governments to identify their most vulnerable individuals and to target the support that they were able to offer. Often, however, issues around the quality of that data, how it's managed, how it's shared, hinder the most effective use of that information, which could really help to improve services. And it's clear that significant barriers still exist in many areas. So in this webinar today, we're going to be looking at all of those issues and much more. We're going to be looking at good practice around the world, but also at some of those remaining obstacles. And we have a fantastic panel with us here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our four speakers. But then once they have given us their opening remarks, this is an opportunity for you, the audience who is joining us today, to put your questions to this expert panel. So on whichever device you are using, you should see somewhere on your screen a Q&A button, a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A button at any time from now on to message in any question that comes to mind while you're listening to the speakers or once they've finished speaking, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can before the end of today's webinar. But let me now introduce our fantastic speakers. First, we will hear from Oliver Wise, who is the Chief Data Officer at the Department of Commerce in America, where he's responsible for the department's data strategy and advancing capacity for evidence-based decision-making by implementing the Evidence Act, which I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about. Previously, Oliver was the founding director of the City of New Orleans Office of Performance and Accountability, and in 2015 was named in the Government Technology's Top 25 Doers, Dreamers and Drivers list. Then we will hear from Antonio Manzi, who is the current National Director of Transfers and Data Analysis at the Ministry of Social Development in Uruguay, where he's in charge of managing monetary transfer programs for socio-economically vulnerable households. His directorate also collects individual level data from more than 30 government institutions, providing a broad view of access to social services. Before this role, Antonio was political officer at the British Embassy in Uruguay, and he was also an analyst at the Central Bank of Uruguay. Then we head over to Denmark, where we'll hear from Henrik Pedersen, who is the country manager for our knowledge partner today, SAS in Denmark, and head of public sales for the Nordics. He's a committed leader who's passionate about how data, technology, and analytics can improve government effectiveness and services. Henrik is also a member of the board of the Danish Industry Association for Digitalization, which is currently working on recommendations for the Danish government on their 2030 digitalization strategy. And he's a member of the advisory board at AI Innovation House in Denmark, which aims to translate digital innovation into practical solutions that boost growth for Danish companies. And then last, but by no means least, we will hear from Dr. Ott Welsberg, who is the current Chief Data Officer for the Estonian government. Ott has extensive experience in coordinating data governance and data science, including in the domains of artificial intelligence, open data, citizen-centric data governance, the once-only principle, data management, and others, much more. And Ott has been kind of a central part of leading Estonia to their trend-setting status in data governance, open data, and artificial intelligence. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. We have a really stellar panel with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity as our audience to message in your questions, and I'll get to those once we've heard from our panel. But without further ado, Oliver, I'm coming over to you for your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Siobhan, and thanks for inviting me to this great panel. It's fantastic to be here talking with colleagues from across the world who are dealing with these challenges of how we apply data to address some of society's most important challenges. So really excited to be here, and I hope everyone had a good Halloween last night. I think there's a global Halloween hangover probably that we're all wrestling through. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my position, the organization I work, the Department of Commerce, and what I think the role of the Chief Data Officer is in promoting value from data to solve big problems. So if you go to the next slide, Raquel, just a little bit about the Department of Commerce. So the Department of Commerce, our mission is to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity for all communities. Our nickname, though, is America's Data Agency, because we are perhaps the largest, we are the largest trove or collector of public data in the US government, and quite possibly the world. We have within our domain the NOAA, the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration, which collects environmental data from the bottom of the sea to the surface of the sun. And indeed, much of its climate data is what informs international policy on climate change. We also have the Census Bureau within our within the Department of Commerce. So the census is the US's main statistical agency and collects demographic, social data, and economic data from every business in the United States. So we have a lot of data and a sprawling, very diverse set of services as well that ranges everything from regulating frequencies, radio frequencies, and promoting broadband, to regulating fisheries, to issuing patents, and nearly everything in between. So it's it's almost like a mini government in itself, in that we have a diverse portfolio of regulatory, statistical, science, and technology functions all under one roof, or loosely in one roof, in that building right there in downtown Washington, D.C. So our priorities, and I list that if you go to the next slide, and I think the role of the Chief Data Officer is really to marry data as an asset to these priorities, is to drive US innovation and global competitiveness, foster equitable economic growth, to address the climate crisis through mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and effort. And the one that's really nearest and dearest to my heart, and the one that I'm accountable for, is expanding opportunity and discovery through data, and also to provide modern services with modern capabilities. So if you go to the next slide there. So the role of the Chief Data Officer is a fairly new one to US federal government. There was a law passed in 2018 that required Chief Data Officers in each of the major federal agencies. And it was part of the Evidence Act, is that law, which also spells out requirements on how the government should evaluate its core programs. And really, the Chief Data Officer, as it's positioned in that law, is our job is to manage the data lifecycle and to govern data so that it can be brought to bear to answer these questions. But I think our role is even quite broader than that. And the way I see it is that the purpose of the position is to accelerate the value derived from data for driving intelligence internally within our own department, the whole of government and with our stakeholders nationwide, and perhaps even international. And so we have very talented social and natural scientists and data scientists, but each their natural course is to go along their own siloed path. And so I think the status quo is that we will have a linear trajectory in terms of the value that will derive from that data. And I think it's the role of the CDO and the Data Governance Board, which I chair, is to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts, and really to bend that curve exponentially so that we're getting more data faster from our data. And there's 3 plays we employ, if you go to the next slide, to realize that vision, to bend that curve. So you go to the next slide. The first is to move from a data ecosystem that's inherently siloed to one that's more coordinated. So right now we're putting that into play with how we manage our supply chain data and data that we acquire from the private sector to inform supply chains, which has been since COVID, a pressing policy priority for the American government. And the way the department historically acquires private sector data is on a bureau by bureau, silo by silo basis. And if you enter into terms with data vendors that are where each silo is their own customer, you can't share that data across the enterprise. So we're working to take a more coordinated approach to acquiring that data, integrating it with our existing data stack, and making it shareable. So you go to the next play. The next one is to move from a data ecosystem that's characterized by bespoke use cases and one that's standardized for reuse and interoperability. So an example of that work is we're working on publishing our census data in schema.org formats so that it can be connected via knowledge graphs to other important public data holdings, such as our NOAA environmental and climate data. And the third big play, and then I'll wrap up here, is to move from a process where it still takes a great deal of manual work to extract data from our systems to answer routine questions to one that's automated. So that's what I'm focused on, and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That's a really great way to start, because I think you've set out some important kind of issues that will resonate. I can see Antonio nodding there already. A lot of the stuff you say, really interesting to hear the scale, the breadth of the remit that you have in that department, just the sheer volume of data that you are dealing with in that department as well, but also how relatively recent it is that the role of the CDOs were set up in legislation in the way that you set out there. And then I think those 3 things that you focused on at the end, the breaking down silos, the need for standardization and more interoperability, and then moving from manual to automation. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience as well will be focusing on very similar priorities. Thank you so much, Oliver, for that. Antonio, I'm coming over to you.
Great. Thank you, Siobhan and the team for the invitation. And it's also a pleasure to be participating in this top level panel and sharing experiences with all of you. So listening to Oliver's presentation really was music to my ears. All the data you guys have and the things you are working with are very similar to where we are. Of course, we're definitely not as advanced as you guys are, but the challenges that you're facing and that you're working to overcome are very similar to ours. But perhaps before that, just briefly as opening remarks, I'll talk a bit later about my specific role in the Ministry of Social Development. But just a bit about my country. Uruguay is a small country. Perhaps not everybody knows much about it, but it's a small country tucked in South America, between Brazil and Argentina. But our tiny size doesn't mean we are doing good things. So we were just discussing before the start of the conversation a recently released e-government survey from this year by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs places Uruguay in a category of high development of e-government. And looking at the index that they form, Uruguay ranked third in countries in the Americas after the US and Canada, and 35, 35th in the world. And also our capital city, Montevideo, it was ranked in the very high category for the local online services index. And finally, we were mentioning with Otto that Uruguay is is the 7th country to join the Digital Nations Network, where we share common practices and we help each other out to keep growing on this issue. So, and one final aspect of this opening remark is the leading agency that moves this forward is the Agency of Electronic Government and Society for Information and Knowledge, which sits in the President's office. It's called AGESIC in Uruguay. But there's also several ministries have their own data analysis offices, and I'm going to share some examples with you guys. So a quick overview in general terms about the challenges of government data. I think Oliver did an excellent job, and I had the same things about the origin of data, who collects it, how it's collected, who owns the data, who's responsible for maintaining it, who stores it, who manages that database, and who can share between each other that information, for what reasons, who overlooks the data protection process. And all these challenges are questions that come up all the time when we're dealing with other government institutions and when we need some information to make better decisions. So, I mean, overcoming these challenges, also Oliver mentioned about a bunch of it, but for example, one of the main issues is that making sure that the data that is being created on its origin is of quality. And because we can have the exchange of information, it's interoperable systems, but if the data point at the moment of creation is not of good quality, then all the systems in the world won't make a good use of it. So that's a big part. But you also don't want to interrupt or take too much time of that data collection for the civil servant that is dealing with a citizen, because we don't want to ask them to fill in all the details of a form and lose time giving a social service or a medical, a medical discussion or things like that. So that's one of the aspects. The other issue is that not all states or not all government institutions have the same evolved system. So in order to connect them, you need to be working with those institutions to make their systems better. And finally, and I think one of the things that will help us, jump over these challenges is really asking the question, why are we sharing, why are we collecting information, and why do we need to share it? I think that's not only important to get citizens involved in this process, but also other government officials to see the value in a better data usage from government. A big question that we ask ourselves here is, why are we asking people to bring different types of documents that the state already has? Why are we asking them to go and take out a birth certificate if we already have that information? And there's several processes and status quo that needs to be broken down. But I think we're gonna move forward with that. And then also taking good examples of data analysis to show civil servants that there is value added in sharing this information. And also at the end is, who owns that information? Is it the institution that collected it, or is it public public asset, like Oliver was saying? So I'm going to quickly run through a couple of examples specifically from my job. As they said in the introduction, I manage the cash transfer programs for vulnerable households, and I also have in charge of the integrated information system for social matters. So first, a note on the first aspect. Our main goal is to reach all vulnerable households that are needing cash assistance alleviate poverty. The question is, how do we reach out to them and how do we target specifically these households? And one quick response would be, okay, just ask for their income and you can see where they are on the income level. But the problem with that is, firstly, most of these households are informal workers, so there's not a standard, you cannot verify the income easily. And another aspect is that income is quite volatile, so we need to focus on some other aspects of structural poverty. In that sense, we send social workers to these households and complete forms that ask questions about the structure of the house, the educational levels of the people, some comfort index, and all that information builds into a database that creates an algorithm that feeds the critical deficiencies index, which determines the probability of being in the first 20% income level without asking income. So that's one use of government, of the data that they give us. But another project that we're almost about to finish now is, instead of going to the households to fill in the information, which of course, moving government resources, people, cars, everything to reach those households implies a lot of government resources, and it implies waiting periods, ever longer waiting periods. And during the pandemic, this issue exploded because we couldn't move people to the households, and now we have a bunch of houses of families waiting for a visit. So we're changing the whole thing, and we're asking the people to come to the office, fill out the form, and then we're using big data to determine the accuracy of that information, and using that index, the reliability index, to take the visit only where those that are least reliable. So that's another use. And I'm already past time. Just a quick note on this integrated information system. We have over 30 government institutions that put in periodic information, individual level information of access to services that they give. So we can have a big cross structure of determining, okay, for this set of people, what are they receiving, cash transfers, social programs, health, etc. And that helps us reallocate issues. Maybe I can get more in detail with the questions because I'm already past the time.
Absolutely.
But thank you very much,
Antonio. If anybody has follow-up questions on what Antonio was saying there, please do send them in. No problem. But really interesting to hear, as you were saying, similar challenges to what Oliver was mentioning at the beginning in terms of working across government departments, those issues that come up quite often in our conversations when we're talking about data on these webinars. Who collects the data? Who owns it? Where does it get stored? Who shares it? The data protection issues, all of those. Quality of data are really important because systems don't fix the quality of the data. But then really interesting to have those specific examples as well, showing how the way that you manage data and collect the data like that can really help drive efficiencies, reduce costs, target those resources, and speed up public services to the citizen. Thank you so much, Antonio. Really interesting to have all of those examples. Henrik, we're coming over to you now.
Thank you very much. Antonio, I actually thought that I was representing the tiny country today, but it seems like I'm a big country with almost 6 million inhabitants in Denmark. So thank you for that.
We have
and actually today we are celebrating democracy in Denmark. It's the day of election for the last 4-year period. We have had one government, and now we have our election. So once I'm done here, I'm going to do my vote, because it's really a celebration for our democracy. But we have also been listening to the politicians doing their campaign, and emphasizing some of the challenges that we are faced with as a country. So I might touch upon a few ones here. Just a few data points on Denmark. We have a GDP per capita of around $68,000, which makes us positioned as top 10 of the world. And of that, actually, GDP, we have a government spend of almost 54%. So we have a huge spend and burden put on the government sector in Denmark. One important note on that is as well that we in the trust index come up very high. Actually, we are top 5 in the world. So as citizens, we have a very high trust in government. And this is very important in actually driving digital service and data sharing agendas for government services. And I think exactly that is one of the things we have succeeded with in a public-private collaboration over many years in Denmark. An example is that in Denmark, you can securely access more than 100 different public services. And on top of that, a very, very large number of private services like online banking with the same secure digital key. So the key to this really being possible is trust. And as mentioned, the long-term collaboration between public and private sector. But like the rest of the world, we are also challenged with the aftermath of the pandemic, the Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis, inflation, high interest rates, supply chain challenges, everything that the rest of you are faced with as well. That's, I guess, a global problem. And we are also faced with other serious challenges in government in Denmark, like, increased financial crime activity, data and cybersecurity issues, not to mention also the climate and sustainability challenge, which is important and has taken a lot of space, luckily, in the election campaigns. So especially the pandemic period, however, showed us the value in being able to share data across government departments and also having a closer collaboration between those. But we also exposed where we definitely have potential to do better in the future, a lot better, if we want to keep up our standard of living. So let me touch upon one common challenge I believe many of us share as well, namely the challenge of an increased burden on the healthcare and elderly care system. In Denmark, we are getting older, fortunately, you could say. Until 2030, we will be 60% more 80 years old in Denmark. And that tendency just seems to continue. And already now we are short of nurses, medical staff, social caretakers, and several other positions in the government space and the healthcare space. And we will not be able to fill these positions. Already now we have a shortage of job applicants. We have a lot of, I think the last number I heard was 40,000, and we are a small country, application not being filled. And it's actually, on top of that, it's a challenge that we share also with the private sector. So there's kind of like the battle for applicants between private and public sector as well. So adding to that, we can actually not afford the continuously increasing budgetary burden on the healthcare system in the future. So there is a general consensus also amongst politicians that we urgently need to speed up the application of welfare technology and use data and AI to work a lot smarter. So just to give you a concrete example on how the healthcare system can work smarter, a case we are working with, a customer we are working with is the Lillebælt Hospital in the region of southern Denmark. So they're taking a data and AI approach for predictive and preventive healthcare, actually developing what they call the AI hospital, building a structure and governance around the application of AI in the hospital. And just to mention briefly a couple of projects they have done. One project is where they are applying AI is for faster diagnostic in the acute for the 15 most common diagnoses. So when you enter that acute in the hospital, within 60 minutes, based on a blood sample and analysis of around 150 biomarkers, the medical staff will get decision support on the most likely diagnosis and be able to start the right treatment very fast. And in the acute, time matters, and it is about saving lives. So another project is around applying the same methodology for actually doing early detection of various cancer types. And so far with remarkable results. So both projects with the purpose of saving lives and increase quality of life for patients, but also to reduce the burden on the hospitals and therefore also reducing costs. So by doing risk stratification on the likelihood for patients to carry certain diagnosis and spend the time and resources on those really in need and on the right diagnosis, and not bring unnecessary concern and treatment to those with none or little risk of having a certain diagnosis, there really is a potential to make better and more efficient use of the warm hands we have in the care system. A natural development of this, of course, would be even more self-care opportunities virtually and digitally. Now, I'm sure in the debate we will touch upon on this, because of course there's a lot of trust needed in this, but there's also, you know, a lot of data ethics. There's also some responsibility around algorithms. So there's a lot of complexity in working with these things that I think that we could discuss. But for now, I would say this was my opening remarks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Henrik. Again, interesting what you said about Denmark topping. I know Antonio mentioned that UN report, but you're saying Denmark topping that in terms of overall how good you are on digitalization in Denmark, and you mentioning high trust.
Yes.
Because I think trust is something that will come up. You also touched on their ethics and the use of algorithms. So trust issues, I think, really important in these kind of conversations. But those health examples that you gave, they're really showing how the use of data and the use then of AI can really shift and change the way public services are delivered. And you mentioned there just a few of the benefits: reducing the burdens, reducing costs, minimizing waste, speeding up diagnosis. So another way of looking at this. Thank you so much, Henrik, for that. And then last but by no means least, Ott, we're coming over to you.
Yes, thank you. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. Not yet. Now, hopefully.
All good. Thanks, Ott.
Thank you. So everyone previously mentioned as well trust, but in Estonia we have a concrete objective of building the human-centric government. So I will briefly cover on what we do actually mean about that and what we have planned right now. So for those who don't know, I'm right now leading Estonian AI, data governance, and all of these typical topics in the end support our vision of building an Estonia full of digital power. We see that digital is part of our economy, that everyone should be valued. The way we operate in our life should be powered by digitalization and so much more. To guide our journey in this digitalization, we have some principles. We need to protect people's basic rights. We need to cherish Estonian culture and language. Unfortunately, in Estonia, we have only roughly 1 million people who speak Estonian language. As part of that, we are investing quite a lot of time and money on ensuring that we are still able to use both private sector and public sector services in our home language itself. We want to maintain trustworthiness, that the government is transparent in how we operate. And everything that we do, we try to do together with companies, with universities, with others. In our government agenda for 2030, from the data side, we have some key objectives. We see that by 2030, the government is AI powered. That means all major decisions are supported by AI. The government is also human-centric, whereby citizens have the power to decide over how government data is being used, and also share government health data with private sector entities and other stakeholders. And we are also pushing towards live event and proactive services. As part of that, we try to make the interaction with the government less burdensome. And if the government already knows that a person is eligible for different grants, subsidies, allowances, then why still it that the person itself needs to ask the government? Instead, we need to be more proactive, also reduce the number of steps required to interact with the government itself. While many of these proactive services don't require any AI, some of them actually do. So for instance, when it comes to unemployment and job search, we have undertaken different projects whereby we are identifying how people, when people are more likely to become unemployed, how to support improving their employability, and so much more. In Estonia, we use the synonym KRET when we talk about AI. KRET comes from Estonian mythology, is built from hay and stitches, and typically KRET carries out different tasks. But with KRET, you always had to be a little bit cautious because KRET could actually turn against you. So we are bringing the same parallel to raise the potential, but also the risk that comes with that. In our first government AI strategy, we set up an objective that we need to have 50 AI use cases by the end of 2021. I'm glad to say that today we have surpassed that goal significantly, and our next objective for the next year is 130 AI use cases within different public sector services. And also we can see that the number of government organizations that are investing in AI, for us, this is really machine learning, has grown significantly. And part of the strategy itself is making different AI components reusable. So both private sector and public sector can reuse them. The latest significant example was real-time subtitling, which is today both used within the government, but also by national broadcasting and other media companies. We are now working on providing complete accessibility via sign language recognition. And there are many other examples as well. We've been carrying out the initial POCs and working on MVPs on optimizing teaching. I mentioned previously the work that we have done together with the Unemployment Agency on training, internship, their impact, when people are likely to become long-term unemployed, and so much more. And here are just some of the examples that we have done further on. In agriculture, we are using satellite image analysis to understand if farmers actually mow the farmland. And this reduces the number of on-site inspections that we need to do. Similarly, what type of crops are being harvested. The end goal, proactively provide subsidies to farmers based on what crops they actually harvest. And here's just an example of the Unemployment Insurance Fund project, whereby we are understanding today quite well when people are likely to become unemployed. Further on, we are trying to rethink on how the government should function in the age of AI. And as a result, in 2020, we came down with the concept called Bürokrat. Bürokrat, in a nutshell, is a virtual assistant. Bürokrat today, I'm glad to say, is the platform itself is developed. The initial agencies have already implemented that. And the idea is to enable citizens to decide on what terms, through what devices, channels, they are able to interact with the government and provide and consume different public sector services, whether from renewing your passport to others. And to ensure trustworthiness, we are working on the citizen-centric data governance roadmap. This includes projects related to privacy-enhancing technologies. We've been working on different projects on generating synthetic data, for instance, whereby the data itself is public, but you don't understand, but you don't get the personal information. We also are planning on making Data Tracker, a central solution that we developed a few years ago, mandatory, whereby citizens are able to see how government is processing their data and for what reasons. And finally, last year, we came out with Consent Service, which allows citizens to share their government health data to private sector via consents. So this is just a brief overview on what we are doing when it comes to data and data-driven decision-making. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, some of those issues echoing what we've heard from the other speakers in terms of you talking again about very proactive government there. So reducing the steps. I think Antonio mentioned that, the kind of tell us once approach. You shouldn't have to repeat your information to government, but really like what you, how you've positioned the, what you call the crack. So the AI approach, so be cautious, but it could also have the risks associated with it. So there are lots of benefits, but fully aware that there could be some risks associated with that as well. But obviously huge progress been made in Estonia on this. So you mentioned there are 96 use cases already of AI being used in government services. More to come, those specific examples in agriculture, again, how AI is being used to target subsidies, so target resources and reduce the need for kind of face-to-face inspections as well. And then looking ahead, as you mentioned, that importance of trust and transparency, so things like the development of the data tracker, so the citizens can see how government is using personal data, but also then important issues that others might have thoughts on about how citizens can then consent to how that data is shared with other parts of government, but also with the private sector. Thank you so much. There are loads to unpack in that final presentation. Thank you to all of you for giving us your opening presentations. You have stimulated already lots of questions from the audience. They are coming in already. I had a first question, and I'm going to combine it actually with one that's come in from the audience. So you all mentioned kind of government departments needing to work together, more coordination on this and the breaking down of silos. My question was going to be, are those silos more a kind of cultural issue, as in people having to learn to work more closely with each other, or is there the need for kind of investment in new systems so that systems are more compatible and can share information and data across departmental silos? And Monty Wieselmeyer has asked just simply, do you have suggestions for helping to break down some of those silos? So my question is about breaking down silos so that we can share data more effectively. Oliver, this was something that you mentioned you were working on, so I'm going to come back to you first for your thoughts on this.
Yeah. I think to break down silos, you have to focus on the problems rather than the actual departments or ministries that you're dealing with, and refocus the conversation and the use cases around those common problems that are truly span silos. So in our work here, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, but supply chain management and industrial policy is something that is inherently cross-bureau at Commerce and really a whole of government challenge, because it deals with labor markets, with transportation, with international trade, with our workforce development programs. All of that is interconnected. So I think, and there's like a tail wagging the dog thing, or I probably got that metaphor wrong, but part of it, data, if you can bring the data to bear to address those problems in a way that's a way of breaking down those silos in its as such.
Yeah.
Just another thing just to keep in mind though is I think silos are inevitable and at the scale of national government unavoidable. So, and they can be very helpful in allowing areas of government to specialize in doing what they do really, really well. So they can be quite productive, but I think it's really incumbent upon people who are in strategic leadership positions around data to focus on the problem and then bring the data that can be brought to bear from across silos to address those problems.
Thanks, Oliver. Antonio, do you agree with Oliver? So you take a policy issue, a problem, rather than look at the departments as these kind of separate entities?
Yes, I think that was a very good point. And for example, on what I work with more are social issues, and those are definitely interconnected between education, health, prison, access to social programs. So I think, I mean, the silos are in part, there is a cultural component of this is what I work with and it's my information. There's also a political aspect, perhaps sometimes is you don't want to take the risk of giving the information and then you generated the data, somebody else, you shared it with somebody, and then that organization didn't use it correctly. And there's also a legal or normative aspect that sometimes actually creates a silo. For example, in terms of the integrated health system here in Uruguay, there is an electronic health record, if you want, I guess that could be translated in that way. But the only one that can access all that information is the doctor when the patient is there and the patient authorizes that information. And that brings up all the information in the system to the doctor. But that information is very rich in order to use for other issues. For example, to predicting at-risk pregnancy before it happens, so we can send social services to help on that process, and a bunch of other examples like that, where you can use AI to predict these possible issues. But in order to do that, we need to get that information. So we are working with that, and I think also Henrik mentioned how the pandemic was an opportunity to really break down, run over those barriers and see the value of actually sharing responsibly this information. And we definitely saw that happening with access to this new transfer program, reaching out to people that were not inside the system. And that implied connecting different information from other agencies to determine the eligible people without them having to come. We could automatically do it. So I think that was a very good example. And once you break that barrier, it's very hard to go back to revert that decision. So I mean, definitely there's a lot of work to do, but if we can manage the legal and normative aspects and modify that, there has to be political will. I think if the people at the top see the value of this information and they can get together and make that trickle down, then we can make the legal changes necessary and even implement forcing these changes. But yeah, no, definitely a lot of work to do there.
Thanks, Antonio. Henrik, your thoughts, because you work with different departments in different countries on this. So, I mean, how much are silos still a big barrier to kind of good data sharing?
So looking from Denmark, I would actually say that we have a siloed approach still, and that it's due to concerns that are mostly GDPR related. But if you don't mind, I would actually like to refer to UK. And a study that was done by Dodge in collaboration with partners Capgemini, Intel, and SAS on how data sharing is unlocking new possibilities for government. And that was the reason why it actually surprised me a bit. It's quite a comprehensive study and survey done with 11 of the largest government agencies in UK. But what it actually told was that 69% of departments share data already with other government organizations. And the concern I had, they actually say that they have dealt with the right governance, and there is trust in sharing data across government agencies. 75% actually said that. So what they are actually highlighting is that there are other barriers to overcome in order to actually put speed on the data sharing. And that's stuff like, the existing technology infrastructure and legacy systems as such, and of course also developing an enterprise architecture perspective of the whole data area. But in UK you have created a central digital and data office, and you have appointed chief data officers for many foundations. So you're trying to centralize kind of like, as I understand it, at least the data office in a bit, and create a common architecture. So that might be a good way forward in my mind.
Thanks, Henrik. We'll make sure we share the link to that report that you are referencing there to everybody who's registered and everybody in the audience as well. Ott, I'm going to come to you. Any thoughts that you have on kind of silos and breaking down silos from this study?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
A specific question for you afterwards. So if you want to answer that, but I also want to come to you on, somebody has asked specifically for you, when you make data public, how do you make sure you don't reveal personal information? So I want to ask you that as well.
Mhm. So regarding silos itself, I guess much has been already said in terms that it is really inevitable. But just to reflect on the Estonians' experience so far, one of the backbone of how our government is actually operating, working is X-Road, which is our data exchange layer. As part of X-Road itself, we have over 3,000 different public sector and private sector services already using X-Road. Over 1.4 billion transactions each year. So this is just for us, data exchange itself doesn't necessarily mean that there are no silos itself. And as part of being in the silos, this is in the end also in terms of ensuring privacy and protection of using data, partly related to data limitation itself. So it is the silos, when we talk about data use, is really beneficial in many terms as well. But oftentimes we find ourselves discussing about silos in terms of how collaboration, or when some government agency or other stakeholder requires data, how burdensome it becomes. So in those circumstances, there are many opportunities, and one of them is definitely what the question from Valeria is also discussing about, how to make data public. So when data is public, it is there are no strict rules when it comes to data reuse itself. And for us, our kind of objective is not always not to reveal personal information, just to be frank. The idea more is you need to consider the benefits and the infringements on privacy to understand where is the right balance. So for instance, if we, just to bring an example, let's take company ownership information. And this is something that in led by European Commission, it is one of the high value data set categories whereby it must be available to everyone. In those circumstances, imagine if you have company ownership information about who are the major shareholders and so on, when you have no private information. I would really say it's useless. Similarly, there are data that, although we are revealing personal information, there are no concrete steps to kind of hide or avoid using. You still find personal information, criminal record. And these are examples whereby in schools, in different circumstances where people are working with children and other risk groups, you need to share that information. Although there are no government-wide rules stipulating that these are kind of the forbids. So you always need to kind of ensure risk and the kind of impact is in balance. But on all other cases, we are right now really working on with UK actually, and with the United States as well on privacy enhancing technology. So we are trying to see on what are the opportunities for us to really kind of reuse data. For us, federated learning is one of the examples whereby we are not compiling all the data together, but rather on different agencies, they are kind of doing their part of the model building, and we are centrally developing further. So this is just one example.
Thanks, Art. Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in. I'm going to combine, I think there are 3 questions that are kind of all in the area of trust, and you've all mentioned trust as a really important issue. So Susan asked at the very first question that came in was about data quality checks. So how can you tell us a bit more about how the quality of data gets checked? How do you know in governments that the data is reliable, especially when you're using it for kind of AI and automation purposes? What happens if it's incorrect, but it's then used in AI? And similarly, Monty again asked, how do you remove bias from data analysis? And I want to add the third thing there then is public trust. So Susan's come in with another question saying, public trust is obviously key, but if data is used for punitive purposes and the public don't experience benefits, they will lose public trust. So I want to ask your thoughts on how can you reassure the public that data is being used, one, for their benefit, but secondly, when you talk about things like AI, that people, civil servants, are aware of the potential bias in the data that they are using. I'm going to change the order a little bit. Antonia, I'm coming to you first on this.
Great. Also a very interesting aspect of this whole data information. Perhaps maybe on the bias of algorithms, I think it's a big question of how we use these complex algorithms and the use of big data and everything in order to provide better services or allocate government resources in a more efficient manner. But it really gets a bit more complicated when the algorithm determines the access to a certain service, or, for example, this for punitive purposes. Are we using an algorithm to, sanction or in some way hurt the citizens? That is a big question. In our case, or at least with what we're working with, in the example of targeting vulnerable households, I explained a bit about this index that we use, the algorithm that determines the probability of being in the first 20% of the lowest 20% income level. So, I mean, that was done to prevent giving a cash transfer only on a social service report, which could lead to a mismanagement of that allocation, and also on biased views or things like that. So we moved on to an algorithm which does this calculation. Now, when you get to a household and that you apply the whole form and the result is negative, the person wants to understand, wait, why if my house is like this and my neighbor has it and we are very similar, why did I get it and why did I not get it? So that really becomes a difficult challenge to overcome, because you cannot explain in detail a complex algorithm. So I think that's something that we really need to work on, specifically for when you're using big data and algorithms to determine access or not to something in the public service. If you're using it to allocate resources to verify or audit or prevent or predict, I don't see much risk there. But for the access of certain things, I think it's a big challenge. But we're working on trying to communicate this better. And then on terms of trust, I think at least in my country that there's a good level of trust in government, at least in the data wise. But you need to take care, because trust breaks very easily, and then to regain it, it's very hard. But I think we don't have, as of now, much issues on that side.
Thanks, Antonia. Ott, I'm going to come to you on the issue of kind of algorithms and trust and quality of data.
Yeah. So part of what we're working on when it comes to data quality itself is, first of all, you need to assign a responsibility within government agencies itself. For us, it really plays down to data stewards who are responsible for metadata management, data quality itself. And then you have the operational issues that you need to work on. So we have assigned what we call standard operating procedures when it comes to ensuring or determining data quality and its dimensions, how and when data quality audits need to be carried out, how often we require it once a year. At the same time, we have different requirements when it comes to risk assessment itself. So these are not always kind of enforced, but when it comes to sensitive personal data, you need to carry out privacy impact assessment, for instance. And similarly, a risk assessment when it comes to data quality itself. And in the end, you have improvement plans when you think of the process itself. So this is related to data quality. And what I find sometimes amusing is people talk about data quality as a objective that is possible to achieve. That data quality is something that you have complete data that is 100% verified and so on. This is something that we need to stop talking about, because this really highlights that the person who is stipulating this kind of requirement has no technical knowledge whatsoever. I'm just thinking of government and just bringing you an example as well. Let's take population registry, and this is applicable to every country represented here, where people live. This is a really nuanced aspect when it comes to where people live, because I might stay here where I'm right now, but I have a house outside of Tallinn as well, and I might actually live there. But from a population registry, if we're talking about the data needs to be correct, complete, updated, there is never a possibility of achieving such results. But regarding kind of the trustworthiness, I guess providing people overview of how government data is being used, it is regulated in the law, it gives some concrete structure on how things actually function. And then you have the openness, and I'm quite skeptical when it comes to providing information on source codes, because really in the end, non-technical people don't get the information. But we need to think in terms of what is the kind of algorithmic standard that provides necessary information. And for us, this is again plays down to the collaboration we are working on with UK. You have a great AI algorithmic standard that you have tested out. So this is just one way for us to test it in our circumstances as well.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I think you've identified there that challenge of being open and transparent, but also in a way that non-technical users like myself can understand. So yeah, not an easy thing to do. Oliver, your thoughts on kind of data quality, algorithms, trust, these kind of issues?
Yeah, sure. My colleague Joy Bonagura, who's the chief data officer, now the chief data officer of the state of California, has a useful slide where to help conceptualize where the potential risk of bias. And one axis is the risk of bias in the data itself, and the other axis is the risk of the potential harms from employing that data in some sort of algorithm, or delivering that service in some sort of algorithmic way. And on the quality of the data, or on that data axis, you have on the left, or the least risk, I think, comes with scientific data or statistical data. So data collected for the ends of collecting that data itself. And I think that's why our statistical agencies, such as the ones that we have at Commerce, are so incredibly important, because there are rigorous protocols to ensure that that data is collected in a fair, unbiased way. And I think it's really like one of the international gold standards on how that data is collected. But as you slide further towards the right of data that's collected as a byproduct of doing something else, yeah, I think there's a lot of risk and bias there, whether it's data from the private sector on credit card transactions or mobility, or from police departments in their arrests. If that data is collected from a process that might be biased in the first place, then certainly there's risk there. I think actually many, at least I know we do a AI use case inventory, and 80 to 90% of those use cases are, I think, quite innocuous. It's often used on most AI use cases at Commerce are about image detection of satellite imagery to identify whale ponds, or to map the bottom of the sea floor. That really, I think there's very low risk for harm, and we're using data that's open, that's rigorously collected, and of high quality. But the risk is definitely there. And just another point, I think this point of trust is really important, and I think that resonated, Antonio and Ott, in your comments, that at like the core of a functional data system in a modern democracy is the upholding a individual's right to privacy and consent in how that data is collected and used. And I think that's incredibly important in modern democracies to hold dear.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Henrik, your thoughts on this question of kind of bias, potential bias in the quality of the data?
Yes, I think it has all been covered very well by this qualified panel, but I have perhaps a different angle on this topic by an example. In the unemployment agency in Denmark, 50% of all unemployed find their own job within 6 months. So we don't really want to spend a lot of resources on that group, but we would like to identify the 10 to 12% that actually are at risk of getting into long-term unemployment. So the unemployment agency actually created an algorithm that could identify those unemployed in risk of getting into long-term unemployment. And that caused a very long debate on whether we actually have a risk of stigmatizing, a number of people as, less worthy, kind of like for the job market. But a good debate. But the thing around trust is that since we have regulation in place, we have data authorities superseding this, it gives the debate, it gives transparency, and that also is one way of getting the trust that things are open. So my perspective.
Thanks, Henrik. Thanks. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. So I think we've only got time for one more round of questions. And what I'm going to do is, because we've still got a couple of questions unanswered, I'm going to pose 2 questions and I'll ask you to answer both very quickly or just one, because we've probably only got a couple of minutes each in this final round of questions. So the 2 questions I'm going to put, one came in from Jonathan saying, do you have any examples of digital tools that you make available to citizens to visualize public data spatially? So, for example, you were talking about some of the agriculture work you do, but are there anything that you make available to citizens? So like interactive maps and dashboards, for example, as Jonathan said, this is an important aspect of information sharing. And then I also, Katie asked, she's curious how much of your work has involved the need to implement new infrastructure, so to migrate from legacy systems, or are you able to do a lot of your data sharing maintaining the existing kind of IT architecture that you have across your government where you are from? So legacy systems and or spatial kind of data tools. Let me come to Henrik. I'll come to you first on this.
That's going to be an easy one because I'm not a government agency. However, I will answer one of the questions. We are involved in quite some project around modernizing infrastructure, and especially also even in EU, actually the migration into cloud. So both lift and shift migration, but also especially evolving new use cases on a new infrastructure. That was the fast one.
Thanks so much, Henrik. Definitely kept it fast. Antonio, or both of those questions.
Great. Really quickly, we do have, for example, to visualize public services, we have a geographical information system. It's very similar, of course, to Google Maps, but with government services relating to public, public provisions like ministry offices, shelters, schools, a bunch of things where you can choose the different layers and you can see everything there and see what the distance is to what you're trying to get. That's a public access, and we use that for analysis purposes to determine, for example, if the school system wants to create a new school for children aged 0 to 5, then we can make an analysis of where individually where those children are and what level of income they are, and where they are the ones that are farther apart from a school. We can group them together in a density point and say, a school system, you should put a school here and you're gonna reach to all these children. So there is a public site to it where everybody can access, And then there's a more detailed analysis of geographical areas. We're also using satellite images in a project to prevent climate change, not prevent the climate change catastrophes, but like prevent, see the impact that they can have on vulnerable households and try to bring services there before. And then on the other side, legacy systems, yes, we do have some issues of moving from those legacy systems to new modern things. But I think the process of breaking down silos and interconnecting systems brings those legacy systems up to a more modern standard. So that's also a push to modernize different government institutions, and a lot to grow over there. Just that. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonio. Ott, your thoughts on kind of using interactive maps and dashboards and how much to update your legacy systems?
Yes. So kind of the interactive maps and dashboards, and also we're providing access to analytical tools to visualize data itself as well. So for instance, we have different maps, outcomes on address data, geological data, soil map, geodetic. We also have how the urban culture and what different animals live across and so on. So on all different areas, it is not only about data, but helping to visualize this information and to make it consumable. When we talk about the other issue itself, kind of legacies always. What we built 2 years ago might already be in some terms legacy to some aspect. And implementing best practices, this is continue to drive more to microservices and so on, domain-driven design. So, but yeah, the short answer is we can never overcome legacy itself. It will always be there.
Yeah, thanks, Ott. Oliver, I started with you, so I'm going to finish with you, your thoughts on kind of legacy systems, but also these, I imagine, because if you said that data that you collect, that you have quite a few interactive tools available for the public with all the data sitting in your department.
Yeah, geospatial analysis is central to nearly everything we do. And really the environmental data at NOAA is inherently geospatial, and so it has a robust GIS department that is producing maps on everything under the sun, from mapping heat islands at a very granular level within cities and neighborhoods to a recent use case was to help state and local governments who are receiving infrastructure bill money. There was a major law to pass to fund $2 billion in new infrastructure development in the United States. And there are scientists at NOAA who are developing maps to help state and local governments factor in climate change to that infrastructure development policy choices, and a lot around equity. So yeah, maps are central. And legacy systems, yeah, we got them. Just the way everyone does. I think there's a lot of effort to modernize our ecosystems, our data ecosystems, and move it to the cloud, but you know, that's a generational effort.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Oliver. And I mean, thank you to all of you on the panel for giving us so much of your time and your expertise today. For everybody who's watching, I think we got through most of the questions. We'll make sure if we didn't manage to answer all of them, we'll try and do that after this webinar. But we will be sending round to everybody who registered and everybody who attended today a link with the video of today's webinar, so you can watch it all again. You can share it with your colleagues as well. On the screen, we're giving you information about another one of our upcoming webinars there on the 8th of November. But if you go onto the Global Government Forum website, you can find information about all of our webinars coming up as well. We have sent around a questionnaire. If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple of minutes to fill that in as well, it means that we can keep giving you exactly the type of webinars that are most interesting and most useful for you. So I'd be hugely grateful if you could take just a couple of minutes to fill in that questionnaire. We will also, in a couple of weeks' time, send a link with an article from today's conversation that highlights all of the key issues that were raised in today's conversation. And I mean, I think the key message that I'm taking away from our great speakers today is, you know, it's not without risks, the use of kind of managing data in different ways, artificial intelligence. There are some risks of actually, if you can get this right and do this well, there are huge benefits, both in terms of kind of cost reductions, reducing error from for government, but also just those kind of huge benefits to the citizen in the way public services can be improved and delivered to the citizens. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers today, to Oliver, to Antonio, to Henrik, and to Ott. As I say, for all of your expertise. Thank you to SAS with Intel for being our knowledge partners today. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you all again very shortly on one of our future webinars. Thanks to the panel, thanks to the audience. Goodbye, everybody. Enjoy the rest
Thank
of the
you.
wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.